Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to all of you here with us in person. How's that? Is that any better? Great. So, once again, good afternoon, and welcome to all of you who are joining us here in person and those of you watching from home on the live stream. I'm Eve Stern, Director of URI Center for the Humanities, and it's a great honor for us to welcome acclaimed author and conservationist Terry Tempest Williams as part of our year-long series, Re-envisioning Nature and Environmental Humanities Lecture Series. This series has brought the URI community together across disciplinary lines to talk about how the humanities can help us understand and engage with the pressing environmental questions of our day. I'd like to offer a special thanks to Dean Reilly and the College of Arts and Sciences for sponsoring and organizing this event. This afternoon, we're in for a treat as Ms. Williams will read from her work and then engage in a conversation with Dean Reilly, followed by question and answers. And I encourage those of you watching the live stream to please type any comments or questions into the chat, and we will be monitoring that. Now I'd like to welcome my colleague, Dr. Marta Elena Rojas, Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies, as well as Director of the Rumowitz Literature of the Sea Seminar, to introduce our speaker.
Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today to introduce Terry Tempest Williams, and also to welcome her to the University of Rhode Island and to the traditional homelands of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic peoples. Thank you for being with us today. It's a tad intimidating to introduce Professor Williams, Miss Williams, so many possible titles. How to do justice to a celebrated citizen writer, an activist, an educator, a relative in the most expansive sense of the word, encompassing people, humans, as well as the other species we share this planet with. Terry Tempest Williams is a prolific writer of nonfiction books and essays and poetry. Signed copies of some of her books are available today at the back. Her long list of publications is matched, perhaps outmatched, by the number of awards her writing and activism have garnered. They're too numerous to list, but I'll share my very favorite one, which I believe is quite an early award, the New York Academy of Sciences Young Children's Science Book Award for The Secret Language of Snow. She has earned enough accolades that if we were to split them among a dozen of us, they would render each of us illustrious. In her writing, Terry Tempest Williams weaves together forms of trauma, of outrage, of grief, and of wonder, capturing a sense of place and of being as multivalent and vivid, even when under the pressure or the process of erosion or erasure. How to describe the structure and the form by which Williams arrives at her effects? Is it juxtaposition? In her book, Refuge, 1991, Terry Tempest Williams relates the twin disasters of her mother's death from cancer and the flooding of the Bear River Migratory Bird Sanctuary. She gives us intertwined stories of a wildlife refuge lost or feared being lost to the rising Great Salt Lake, and her mother's battle with cancer. She widens the scope to let us witness a generation of her female relatives, the clan of one-breasted women, a wider Mormon community, and even when not directly mentioned, all the peoples living downwind from the federal government's atmospheric nuclear weapons testing. Her mother, her women, and her birds. Memorialized in details so vibrant, they stand for themselves and for all the desert inhabitants, devastated and yet enduringly beautiful. Sometimes the structure of her work takes the form of a triptych. There is a medieval and sensuous one, The Garden of Delights, at the heart of her 2007 book, Leap. Williams is herself, on occasion, collected into a triad. For instance, in a 2017 New York Times Book Review feature, provoked by Donald Trump's assault against 2 national monuments in Utah, she is grouped with Thoreau's Walden, John Muir's Yosemite, and there, Williams' 2016, The Hour of Land, a personal topography of America's national parks. Each is deemed an homage to nature. We might possibly quibble as to which 3 we might choose to be there along with her book. Might it be Rachel Carson's The Sea Around Us, or perhaps Alexis Pauline Gumbs' Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Animals? Those would be my grouping. These writers all, and here I include, of course, Thoreau and Muir, they all share an ethical and rhetorical insistence that we take measure of ourselves by taking measure of our relation to the planet's formations and its species. Terry Tempest Williams consistently presents us with an exhortation to treat that relation as sacred, with an urgent undertone that demands we bridge the personal and political, since they are, like the past and the present, inextricable. We have been dead to the world that is alive. We as readers and today's audience may notice how she uses palimpsests, layering upon layering that lets us always see what lies beneath, even as we are glancing at a shimmering surface. And recursiveness, a pattern of cyclical return that varies with each encircling. These construct her thinking, and they are not repetitions exactly. In When Women Were Birds, she teaches us about reputations. I'm sorry, I can't say that. Reputations? Reputations, thank you. She returns us to landscape, sometimes the one she calls home, sometimes those that others do. Landscape in these books is not merely land. Landscape is not simply aesthetic, not in our form we might see on a canvas in a gallery. It's not landscaping either, not the kind of landscaping that might result in cookie-cutter beautification of suburbia. In Spanish, the word for landscape is paisaje, and it includes the land and all that subsists on that land. Its weather, its biome, earth teeming with life. In wildness is the preservation of the world. One final thing. I want to share Ophelia Cepeda's Carrying Our Words. It's a very, very short poem. Carrying our words, we travel. We arrive at the ocean. With our words, we are able to speak of sounds of the thunderous waves. We speak of how majestic it is, of the ocean power that gifts us songs. We sing our respect and call it our relative. Terry Tempest Williams, I would cross the plains with you to arrive at the ocean and call it our relative. Please welcome Terry Tempest Williams.
Good afternoon. Marty, that was the most generous, thoughtful introduction I have had, and I just want to honor your insights and revelations to me of what you see. I would love to be a student in one of your graduate seminars. So thank you so much. I think we all thank you. I think this is why the humanities matter. They remind us why words matter. They remind us why stories matter. And they give us a different narrative, especially at this moment in time. And when our English departments and our other disciplines within the humanities, arts and humanities, are under siege, it is so important for us to support the professors and the students who dare to go into these territories. And so I'm deeply grateful to you. I want to honor Jen, Dean Reilly. We met in 2005 at the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth, and I knew she was brave then. She picked for a common reader one of my books called Red, Passion and Patience in the Desert, and I couldn't imagine such a terrible choice for New England students. And she just said they need to know about other places. And I will never forget our encounter there with the students, with the power of their questions, and your courageous leadership, which I now see being rooted here at the University of Rhode Island. And I honor you. I would follow you anywhere. And thank you for your greatness of spirit. I was thrilled to be able to meet Mary Parlange. Mary, where are you? There you are. A fellow sister of the American Southwest. Your history is rooted in Los Alamos, as mine is in the Nevada test site. And when I said you looked familiar, maybe, as you said, it was this atomic glow that we both still radiate from. But to you and the president, thank you for what you're creating here. I just have to say, you know, Marty, I love Alexis Pauline Gumb's book, Undrowned. And if you haven't read it, that would be something that I would highly recommend. She breaks rules, she covers new ground, and I think she says the word "I love you" 100 times. It's a beautiful book that makes the trajectory of her ancestors, her African ancestors across the Atlantic, and she then turns to sea mammals, black sea mammals, as mentors. It's a beautiful integration of culture, narrative, memoir, and natural history. Today I had such a great moment seeing your campus with Kathy Desiree, Chris Bovey, and Rod Mather. What a gift to be able to see your campus through the lens of the humanities, through history, through anthropology, through indigenous roots, enslaved people, the architecture that has left an indelible mark on the liberal politics of Rhode Island, which I appreciate coming from a state like Utah. And to be able to know where we are, Wendell Berry tells us, allows us to know who we are. And this was an unprecedented tour. I can't wait to tell everyone about it, and that it is happening here at the University of Rhode Island is very inspiring, followed by a class. So thank you for that. And Eve, thank you for what you do, for what you carry, for all the ways you make this atmosphere conducive to learning and to creative thinking. So we honor you. Thank you for being here. I'm going to read just for about 15 minutes. It's something relatively new, and let me just give you a quick background. During 2020, during the first summer of the pandemic, we all remember where we were and how isolated. I met a young woman named Bianca Giever, And I was a fan of hers. She has a website, and I wrote her a letter. We ended up becoming pen pals, and she said, what are you doing right now? And I said, I'm night walking. And she said, may I join you? So she was in Vermont, I was in Utah, and every night we would night walk. And then when we returned home, we would write each other audio letters, speak them, write them, and then speak them. This went on through for a full moon cycle. An intimacy developed, cross-generational correspondence. She was 30 at the time. I think I was 62. And we became soulmates. And we both of us were heartsick when this ended. Why was I night walking? Because of the smoke, because of the fires. She also is a stringer for the New York Times, works there, and she was sent to Los Angeles. Major fires. She couldn't see, she couldn't breathe. She called me and she said, Terry, I don't know where I am, I don't know what to do. The sun is like a cigarette burn through the sky, the smoke. When I woke up, all I could think of was the phrase, an obituary for the dead, will you write one? I don't even know what that means. And if it had been anyone else, I probably would have said no, out of fear. But this was Bianca. This was a young person asking something of an older person. And I said, I'll try. And she said, thank you. I need it in an hour. And writers know what deadlines mean. This is a burning testament. With these ashes in hand that have fallen from near and far on the drought-cracked desert of Utah, I raise my fist to a smoke-choked sky to honor the holy creatures, human and wild, who have lost their lives and homes to the galloping flames like riderless horses burning through the west. We are witness to ghostly horizons lit with the scalding colors of red, orange, purple, black, the blowout of close to 5 million acres of land being ravaged by fires with such velocity, it is melting our capacity to feel the full magnitude of what is happening. We are not okay. We are anxious. We are scared. There is no place to run. There is no place to hide. There is only our love and grief to hold us in the terror of all we are seeing, sensing, denying. We can't touch the source of our despair because we can't touch each other. And so we retreat inside when everything outside is screaming. We are sitting in rooms watching screens alone, waiting as if this is a pause instead of a place, the place where we find ourselves now. The facts do not tell the story of how our hearts are breaking, nor do the photographs of blackened forests or lone chimneys standing as monuments to homes once inhabited. The news does not speak to the terror of flames lapping at our heels that we can never outrun, only pray for a change in the wind. No one is reporting the smells of burnt fur or feathers or leaves and sap, nor the cold, hard truth of those who find them missing, frozen in their last gestures of escape beneath a blanket of ashes, Not even the stories reported by biologists in New Mexico who are picking up the bodies of hundreds of thousands of migrating birds in mixed flocks of warblers, flycatchers, sparrows, and finches, found dead on the ground in Great White Sands, with no explanation but the conjecture that they died from exhaustion. We have been living a myth. We have constructed a dream. We have cajoled and seduced ourselves into believing we are at the center of all things. With plants and other sentient beings, from ants to lizards to coyotes and grizzly bears, remaining subservient to our whims, desires, and needs. This is a lethal lie, that we will be seen by future generations as a grave moral sin committed and buried in the name of ignorance and arrogance. It is true, we've mismanaged our forests and suppressed fire for decades. We've ignored and failed to listen to the wisdom of indigenous peoples who have understood and lived with fire for generations. We have built our homes within the woods when we should have respected the necessary breathing spaces between the domestic and the wild. We have overbuilt and overridden the carrying capacity of and landscapes, underestimating the limits of water in times of drought. We are in drought. We have sacrificed the integrity of fragile and iconic landscapes for the development of oil and gas to fuel the, quote, American way of life, unquote. This is freedom unmasked. We have a right to live as we wish until we can't. Our reckless history of human habitation in the American West is on a collision course with the climate crisis. Climate change is not a hoax. It is real, and it is a fire-breathing dragon blowing fire at our doors. We cannot breathe. This is our mantra in America now. We cannot breathe because of the smoke. We cannot breathe because of a virus that has entered our homes. We cannot breathe because of police brutality and too many brown bodies and black bodies dead on the streets. We cannot breathe because we are holding our breath for the people and places we love. I was asked to write an obituary for the land, but I realize I am writing an obituary for us, for the life we have lost and can never return to. And within this burning of Western lands, our innocence and denial is in flames. The obituary will be short. The time came, and these humans died from the old ways of being. Good riddance. It was time. Their cause of death was the terminal disease of solipsism, whereby humans put themselves in the center of the universe. It was only about them. And in so doing, they had been dead to the world that is alive. To the power of these burning, illuminated Western lands that have shaped our character, inspired our souls, and restored our belief in what is beautiful and enduring, I will never write your obituary. Because even as you burn, you are throwing down seeds that will sprout and flower. Trees will grow and forests will rise again as living testaments to how one survives change. It is time to grieve and mourn the dead and believe in the power of renewal. If we do not embrace our grief, sadness will come out sideways in unexpected forms of depression and violence. We must dare to find a proper ceremony to collectively honor the dead from the coronavirus. As we approach, then it was 200,000 citizens lost. Now it is well over 1 million. We must honor these lives engulfed in these Western fires and the lives we will continue to lose from the climate crisis at hand. Only then can we begin the work of restoration, respecting the generations to come as we clear a path toward cooling a warming planet. This will be our joy. Let this be a humble tribute, an exaltation, an homage, and an open-hearted eulogy to all we are losing to fire, to floods, to hurricanes and tornadoes, and the invisible virus that has called us all home and brought us to our knees. We are not the only species that lives and loves and breathes on this miraculous planet. This miraculous planet called Earth. May we remember this and raise a fistful of ash to all the lives lost that it holds. Grief is love. How can we hold this grief without holding each other? To bear witness to this moment of undoing is to find the strength and spiritual will to meet the dark and smoldering landscapes where we live. We can cry. Our tears will fall like rain in the desert and wash off our skins of ash so our pores can breathe, so our bodies can breathe back the lives that we have taken for granted. I will mark my heart with an X made of ash that says the power to restore life resides here. The future of our species will be decided here, not by facts, but by love and loss. Hand on my heart, I pledge allegiance to the only home I will ever know. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. I actually feel like I've been in conversation with you for the last several weeks because after reading her books, I've been driving a lot for my family, and I've been listening to her read Erosion in my car, and I just went to the National Parks book. So in my car, I'm going back and forth with Terry all the time, and as I said to her earlier, I'm either peacefully going along or I'm in tears, depending on which section that you're moving through at that time. I'll second everyone just for a second that we're very fortunate to have Terry with us today. I think this speaks to one of the best things we do as a university, which is bring people into conversation and bring people into different ways of knowing and thinking about the world that we live in as we seek to solve some of the greatest problems we're going to face going forward. And I think Terry's one of those writers, as Marty said, a citizen writer, a citizen activist, who's out there trying to sort of give us a flashlight to help us find that right way down. And it's fortunate that we get to be in conversation with you today.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much.
I told Terry I was going to take her on a little bit of a retrospective, and I'm going to start with Refuge. And for those of you who are familiar with her first book, which Marty spoke about very well, a memoir about her mother and her grandmother, as well as the drought that was facing the Great Salt Lake during that time. One of the key questions she asked in that book is, how does one find refuge in change? And that was 31 years ago. So my question to you is, how would you answer that question today?
I think I'm still asking it. You know, certainly we're in a time of great instability, uncertainty, and how to live with the questions. I'm not so interested in the answers. It's interesting you bring up Refuge 31 years ago. It's a book about the rise of Great Salt Lake to its historic high, 4212 feet above sea level. And now we are at, 30 years later, at Great Salt Lake's historic low, which last I checked it was 4187. And I just got back from circumnavigating the lake to see for myself what was happening. It's devastating. For as far as you can see, it's a horizon of salt. The south arm is 18% salinity at the upper reaches of what the brine shrimp can handle. But I was telling Chris, what we also know is that the brine shrimp have adapted to change, in answer to your question, that they go into a cyst period of their life cycle, and they can be dormant inside that cyst for over 50 years. And then when the waters come, they will burst forth. You know, so I think about what can we come to know. When I was at the lake at Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, it was about a mile walk to the edge of Great Salt Lake now. And I feel comfortable saying this to you because it's the truth of how I live my life. I knelt down on the edge of the lake, put my hands in the water, and I listened to her. And what I heard in my heart, and as a writer, I know my own vocabulary, and this was not of my vocabulary, was, I am not dying, I am in retreat. And then what I heard was, it is not what you think. And that really shifted my point of view. You know, what are the cycles we're talking about? Is it a human life? Is it on the scale of geologic time? And what might Great Salt Lake be saying to us about that question? How do we find refuge and change? What does retreat mean? And I actually looked up that word. What does retreat mean? And I was surprised. It means staying home. And I think one of the things that moved me so much about this tour today here at the University of Rhode Island is that tour was about staying home and knowing our history, so that then we can find refuge and change, because we know the species that we're living among. We know the indigenous people whose stories are here. We know the stone of the buildings that we are residing inside. And we know the power of the tides, high tide, low tide. It's the same with what I experience in the desert, that we are both eroding and evolving at once. I think by knowing where we are, by knowing the cycles that are being disrupted and also the cycles that are still at play, it allows us to find a grace note, if you will, in change. I was struck by, I asked Jen if I should, which piece of what I brought I should read. And I said one of them is really dark, and one of them's quite upbeat. And I read the upbeat one. So you can imagine, where I've been. I'm not afraid of the dark. I think night vision is something we can cultivate in these times of change. And what I learned in my night walks was that color emerges, that your eyes adjust. And I think we're in the process of adjusting to dark times. But they can be beautiful.
You've gotten me off track, but it brings me back to what you talk about in Erosion when you talk about the story of Willie Gray Eyes and the Bears Ear Monument and that idea of dwelling. And what you're trying to have us rethink, as he does, that word dwelling. And I think that's part of what you're talking about in this idea of refuge and change, that if we rethink how we interact with things and what we mean by space and home, perhaps it makes us look at the world differently.
I'm so glad you brought up Willie Gray Eyes. This is a powerful Diné Navajo community leader. And he sued the state of Utah for improper gerrymandering that was based in racism. And he won the case. And what he said is, if the open space of democracy opens, then I have an obligation to stand inside it. And so he ran for county commissioner. He won. What I will call frontier Mormons, my relatives, fought the election, as is so often the case now in this country. And what they said was, Willie Gray Eyes is not a citizen of Utah. What they said was, Willie Gray Eyes does not belong here, even though he and his family have been for generations at Navajo Mountain. What they said is, you have no right to hold an office in this country. They went to court. I went to the trial. It was a very conservative judge, newly appointed by our former president. There were only 3 Native people allowed in that court. The rest were white. It was terrifying. What Willie Gray Eyes said in his defense was, I am a citizen of the state of Utah because my umbilical cord is buried here. You can imagine how that went across in the state of Utah. Everyone laughed, they were heckling, and they gave a defense that was full of lies, full of prejudice, and cruel. It went on for 8 hours. The judge said, we are going to conclude this trial today. And I will come back with my decision in an hour. He came back with his decision, and he said this: Willie Gray Eyes is not only a citizen of the state of Utah, he understands dwelling in a way that we, as fellow citizens, can only hope to emulate. It was one of the most beautiful decisions I've ever experienced. Willie Gray Eyes has changed politics in San Juan County. And he has been ridiculed, he has been harassed, he has been abused in unimaginable ways. And I saw him recently at a friend's funeral, and I said, "How are you doing, Willie?" And he said, "What I've learned is gratitude, so that when I receive the insults, I look at the person delivering it, and I say, 'Thank you.'" And he said, "Now they don't know what to do." Willie Gray Eyes ran again for a second term as county commissioner, and he lost. He will run again.
One of the story of Willie Gray Eyes is part of this, because one of the things you often return to in your writing is the way in which an individual can create change. And I think that part of, when I looked back at your writings, you see this way in which you continually come back to the idea of mosaic, the idea of assemblage, the idea of even erosion. I think of red, right? The landscape is red, it's magenta, it's salmon, it's pink, it's all of these things in different shades. And can you talk about how, when you're writing about the land, you're talking about in part what Marty referenced in the beginning, that idea of interdependence, what you were talking about in this reading, that we are not the center, and how land itself, the national parks, open spaces, can reorient people to become the change like a Willie Gray Eyes.
I think mosaic, the idea, the metaphor, and the reality of mosaic is that it is a conversation with that which has been broken. And I love that idea, because I think we're all broken and we all come from broken spaces. And so how do we take that which is broken and create something whole? I also think it's useful in the idea of, what do we do at this moment in time? What have we always done in these moments of uncertainty and war, even a civil war that is raging in our own country, a war of ideologies? I think we figure out, what is the tessera, what is the one piece that we hold that can contribute to the whole. You know, I write, that's my piece of the mosaic. I would dare say, you lead. You know, that is a beautiful piece of the mosaic. And I think for each of us to think about, what is my gift and how can I offer it up in the name of community? It makes change less daunting, because I think when these global issues are so huge, we think, where do I fit? What can I do? But if we just look at, what is the one piece I have? What is my gift, and how can I share it with my community? That's, to me, where I find the joy, where I find the mosaic that emerges in a surprising, beautiful way, and how we are held to account. You know, we live in a really small community, and we have to be kind to one another, because, as happened on October 2nd, my husband and I found ourselves in a massive flash flood, and it came very close. We came close to losing our house. You know, we had to call the mayor. We had to call our neighbors, that we have very different ideologies. You know, we had to rely on our neighbors to help. And I think that's how it should be. To learn how to be neighborly, to know who our neighbors are, and in spite of our differences, to honor them and find a language among each other that opens our hearts rather than closes them. And that is not easy. I can tell you, it's not easy around our Thanksgiving dinner table. But we still love each other. And it's not an option not to, for me.
So I think it would be useful for, I know we have some of our students in the audience who are in creative writing classes and everything, and I'm going to go back to Marty again, because she referenced this, the way in which you use layers in your writing, palimpsests in your writing, the recursiveness of your writing. To me, that's echoed in the land that you're actually writing about, so that there's an interconnection. I think back to Red again, which I made the students read it because it's a beautiful book and you should all go read it.
I remember one of them said, why should we care about the desert? And I thought, who is this woman that forced them to think about that?
But if you've read Red, you can go and sort of what you're doing, you bring it back in erosion, because in Red you talk about erosion, the way in which wind and rain shapes the canyon lands. It shapes Arches National Park, that it's weathered, it's worn. We see the land move and shift. Even today, as we were walking across campus, and Rod and Chris and Kathy were talking to you about how the water has been moved on this campus, about the landscape of URI itself, that if you know it and you know where to look, it gives you a different sense of place. So I think it'd be interesting for students to think about, for you to share how your writing and place and land are intertwined, because to me they are.
I have to tell you, I do not know. A student of mine showed me some, the syllabus that she was engaged in, and what the requirements were in terms of writing and the points given. I would have failed. I don't know what a topic sentence is. I don't know what they were talking about in terms of how you write sentences. It was just, I had my hand up here because it was just a stranglehold on anything creative. So I have to tell you, much of what I do is instinct. I don't have a plan. For me, it's about paying attention. It's about falling in love with a place and making a commitment to it. It's being present. And it's also about anger. I write out of my love and I write out of my anger. And the words reveal themselves. I also think in the desert, maybe your language, maybe my language is very simple. Deceptively so, I would say, like the desert, in that the sentences are short and lean. I have a friend who writes out of Costa Rica, and it's lush, and they're long sentences, and it's humid text. My text can be really dry. My father tells me it puts him to sleep. Sometimes the desert puts people to sleep. I remember bringing some Japanese friends out to Great Salt Lake, Antelope Island. They were asleep before we even got there because of the monotony of the landscape to untrained eyes. So I think the landscape dictates the diction. I would say that just because that's what you've grown out of.
When you look at that landscape, one of the things, and you talk about this in the Open Space of Democracy, this is a small chapbook if you're not familiar with it. It was a series of 4 books, actually, that came out looking at the way in which land, I think you're doing this in the National Parks book as well, the way in which land itself and how we interact with land and our need in the United States for open spaces speaks, and we were speaking about this a little earlier, to democracy and the ways in which open spaces can teach us something about how to sustain and what we need to bring to sustain democracy in our country.
It's a tough one. And land is...
I mean, it's
It's
money.
We have a sign in our little community. It used to be called the People's Republic of Castle Valley. It was the only liberal little bastion in southern Utah. And no one really likes to talk to each other. That's why they're there. It's pretty remote. But it's changed, and it's changed a lot in recent years where a lot of survivalists want to be there. They're alone. And it's gotten... it's more contentious, I will say. And Brooke and I were out walking around the neighborhood, and there was a huge billboard in front of one of the homes, and it said, "If you're not my friend, you're my bullseye." And it had a huge American flag as well as a bullseye that had been shot out. That's pretty unnerving and not my idea of neighborliness. It's intimidating. And yet, how do we work with that? How do we work around it? What's the openness and spaciousness in that message. So it's a struggle, but I think about Gertrude Stein when she talks about the vitality of the struggle. Because we each have to take responsibility for finding ways to cross those boundaries. Two things I want to say. One, I just got back from Poland, and so I'm in that space. I was invited on a State Department diplomacy mission with writers, and it was 12 writers from around the world. There were 3 writers from the United States. There were 5 Ukrainian writers, and it was about borderlands. And talk about the privilege that we have as American citizens. My task was to listen. I know nothing about war. And to listen to the Ukrainian writers talk about the power of language, the responsibility of writers in the face of war, to uphold democracy. It was so moving to me. Also, their wicked humor, the buoyancy of what they were coming to understand in war. And at that time, the 2 missiles had just hit in Polish soil. They were in and remain in electrical energy blackout, which is another kind of terror where they can't have access to the world because there's nothing to, their devices aren't being able to be plugged in. They don't know how their families are, and it is dark, pitch black. So it was a revelation. But what we came to was the notion that we do know war. All of us know war. Whether it's the war we're seeing in this country, which is a war of ideologies, whether it's the war on the planet with climate crisis, or whether it's the war in Ukraine. I think what we ended up discussing was the interconnected and interrelatedness of all of it. Whether it's Syria, whether it's the fossil fuels that are driving this war in Ukraine. And how do we see that interconnectedness? And how do we make change? These were huge questions. The other thing I noticed is that these were really rigorous conversations. They were debates, there were disagreements, there was a lot of listening, there was a lot of considering, there was even changing of minds, including my own. I'm not seeing that on our college campuses. I'm seeing fear with our students. I'm seeing fear as faculty. And I see a lot of performative language. And it's one thing that I think as people within learning communities, and even where we live, how do we have conversations that are real? And where there's enough trust developed that we can grapple together in creative ways about what we're up against. Because it can't be performative, because there's nothing to hold that up. And I think that was the most important thing I left with, is how hungry I am for honest, hard, difficult conversations. And we were talking about dinner parties, and I think that's one thing Brooke and I have been trying to do now that things are opening up around with COVID, is can we have mixed dinner parties with people that don't agree, but create an atmosphere of conviviality and hospitality to where we can exercise good manners, but we can still have honest conversations and really learn about each other. That's really important to me right now. And I think college campuses are a beautiful way to do that. And I was so moved by the ways in which you are doing that in your lunches, in your open spaces that you are creating for these kinds of honest conversations.
I think one of the, as we were talking earlier about, to me, a university is the key central place that we are safe to have these conversations. And as we're coming back from the pandemic, it's about how do we rebuild those spaces of community where those difficult conversations can take place as we come out of retreat back to where we are here at URI to build that again. And it's a challenge to determine how to do that.
And to look at each other in the eyes, to be able to look at body language and see there is something deeper, there is something beyond words that we're missing if we're only behind our screens or if we're texting or, even a telephone call. I think it's so important that we meet each other fully present with an open heart.
It's part of the dance that happens in your writing, I think, is that one of the things, the patterns I see, pattern's not a very good word, I think dance is the better word, but it's the individual in solitude. Adrienne Rich talks about this in some of her poetry, right? What is an individual in solitude? What is the individual in community? And how do you move back and forth between the two? And I think some of your metaphors of going into, I think of Refuge, going into the refuge, looking at the birds there, looking when the drought was coming down, happening, and then the lake is going down, and then coming back to your family and being in that community and taking what you had learned from the refuge to how do you engage with that community. There's something, I think that you're writing about how the land itself can inform how we be with one another.
I appreciate that, Jen. There's a pulse to things, isn't there? Whether it's a pulse to the marsh, the wetlands, a pulse to this room. I was saying to Jen, this is the first time I've been at a university campus in person in 3 years. I could weep seeing you, feeling you, having a spontaneity here where it's not on Zoom. And to those of you who are at home, thank you for joining us, and we miss you. It's an effort. It's an effort, and I think, but when we're present with each other, there is a pulse, and you ask, how does the land instruct us? One of the great things that happened during the pandemic is that this group of scientists came to Castleton Tower, Castle Valley, where we live. There's a 400-foot monolith of sandstone. It's one of the largest in the world. It's also a very popular climbing route. Jeff Moore, the lead scientist, geologist, had a hunch. He wanted to know how this structure had maintained its solidarity through time, through millions of years. He also wanted to know what were the vibrations inside that stone. Jonah Yellowman, who's a friend of mine, is a medicine person in Diné, and he speaks a lot about how the rocks are alive. Now, maybe we would debate with that, maybe we would not. But for him and for his people, those rocks are alive. They're living beings. Well, Jeff Moore found that that was exactly right. And what they did is they put, what is it called, that registers earthquakes?
Where are my scientists? Thank you.
Seismometers, sorry. They took these seismometers and placed one at the base of Castleton Tower, and then they enlisted 2 climbers to take another seismometer up to the very top. And then he was back at, ground zero, listening to what happened. What happened was a huge surprise to them. What happened was, in the seismometer that registers those beats, it sounded like a fetal monitor. What they recognized was a pulse. A pulse. If we had that tape here, you would hear what sounds like a human heartbeat. When there were climbers, it sped up. When there were helicopters as a disturbance, it was erratic. What they also found in that recording that was registering these waves, they could identify wave action from the Pacific Ocean, the gurgling of magma below, and even conversation. Castleton Tower has a pulse. We have a pulse. The earth has a pulse. hand on stone, hand on heart. It's all interconnected, interrelated. I find that so instructive, that we live in a responsive world, that the universe is responsive. I've been taking this class at the Harvard Divinity School from Charlie Hallisey in Buddhist studies, and he said something the other day that was really powerful to me. He said, compassion is not a human emotion. It belongs to the universe. Think about that. We belong to a responsive universe. If that is true, then I believe our actions would be different. And that we do have the power to change outcomes.
As you write, in Erosion, you talk about we need not lose hope. We just need to find where it dwells. Right? And I think about that a lot. I think I said to somebody yesterday, every day I think about you can always make it better. Right? And when you live in that state, it becomes a different conversation with people.
And I think that dark piece I was talking about, it was when last year I went out to Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge, which I love so much. It's 70,000 acres of wetlands that sparkle and sing on the edge of Great Salt Lake. We went out there and it was literally a sun-baked playa. There was no birdsong. There was no water. I didn't know how to even accommodate that, to accept it, to hold it. And we just kept walking until we finally found some fingerlings of water. And there, a great blue heron, a black-crowned night heron, a bevy of gulls, California gulls, and one double-crested cormorant with its arms outstretched on a piece of driftwood looking like a black crucifix against the salt flats. You know, what do you do with that? And I think what came out of that writing was that there is something deeper than hope. That's what I'm thinking about now. There is something deeper than hope. And for me, that is engagement. That is bearing witness. That bearing witness is not a passive act, but an act of conscience and consequence and consciousness. So I'm thinking about that. And thank you for reminding me that, you know, it is knowing where hope dwells. And I think it is in the vitality and resilience of the earth itself. I mean, the earth will survive us. I think we have to ask ourselves, will we?
I think it's time to open this up to the audience. And Terry's happy to take questions. I think we have one right there. You want to do that, Eve?
You've written about the commencement address that you gave at the University of Utah, I believe. Have you had the courage to give another commencement address since then? And are you open to such thing? I was thinking about a nomination. Can I have one more?
You bring up a tender point. I will use the word fired from the University of Utah in 2016 for purchasing oil and gas leases on public lands. So my heart is broken about the University of Utah. I love that school. I love my students there, and I miss not being there. Have I given another commencement address since? Certainly not of that caliber, you know, meaning that political. But of course I'm open. It's a privilege to do so. I think it's the hardest speech one can ever give, because really, what do we know? I think the students should be giving their own commencement addresses, you know. But these are hard times, and I think words carry a lot of power. And I think one of the things that I came away with after being with writers who were refugees from Myanmar, an incredible writer named Coco Thet. He is now a person on the move. He is so brave, you know, and I think about, there were people from the Mauritius Islands. They're wondering, will they be displaced? As some of our tribal nations in the Arctic have just been told that money is coming for them to be displaced. I think what I left with was we have to be braver. And as writers, it may not, what am I trying to say? It may create a disturbance. But I think we have to tell the truth as we see it, the hard truths. Otherwise, we're in denial. So that's my commitment. And if I were to be invited to another commencement, I would want to be as bold and straightforward as I could with the generation that I have so much respect for. Because I see this generation, and for you students who are here in this room, as pragmatic visionaries. And I honor you.
Thank you. And we're all students here in one way or another, and I was wondering if you could explain to us how one writes such a beautiful obituary in 1 hour. Perhaps you didn't.
Terror. I think it's out of love and sheer terror, and deadlines. I really respond well to deadlines. I couldn't have written that leisurely. Yeah.
You mentioned the writers from Ukraine that you talked to. I wanted to ask, in your opinion, do you think that the duty of a writer changes in times of war or in times of hardship?
Boy, that's a great question. Does the duty of a writer change in times of war and hardship? I would have to think about that. I think I would say for me, my obligation as a writer is to respond to the time that I have and to the time that I am born into, and to not look away. May I read to you a poem by one of the Ukrainian writers? It's so beautiful. I called her today and asked her permission, and I will give you her first name, Victoria. These are brave writers, and they are at risk. I mean, these writers could die and be shot because in war, intellectuals, writers, artists, those who belong to the borderlands are the most dangerous because they remind us why we have to fight and why we have to live. This is by Victoria. Homecoming story. When Mira was leaving home, she took a bead from her jewelry box. When Tim was leaving his town, he picked up a rock from the street. When Yarka was leaving her garden, she took an apricot pit. When Vera was leaving home, she took nothing. I will be back soon, she said, and took nothing at all. Mira had grown a jewelry box from her bead. She is growing new home in the box. Tim has started a city from his rock. The city is like his hometown, except there is no sea. Yarka has planted her apricot pit. Now she has her own orchard around it. And Vera, who took nothing at all, she is telling this story. When you are fleeing your home, she says, behind your back, home gets smaller to save itself. Your home turns into a gray rock, a bead, a last year's apricot pit, a Lego figure, a seashell from Crimea, a sunflower seed, a button from Dad's uniform. And then the home fits into your pocket, and there it sleeps. You should pull home out when you are ready in a safe place. Little by little, your home will grow, and you will never remember, never ever be homeless. So what did you take with you? I only took this story, the story about homecoming. Here, I pulled it out into the light. It is growing. I think that's a writer's obligation.
Hi. So you mentioned a bunch of times that there's a connection between humanity and nature, even saying that some emotions are not only human, but they belong to the universe as well. In your opinion, how is it so easy for people to forget that or to just not notice it?
Thank you. That's such a great question. How do we forget what we're connected to? I forgot until I was sitting around this table with writers from around the world who were truly brave, who were risking their lives for what they were writing. I forgot why words matter. I forgot the power of that vocation. And I realized I had become afraid. How does that happen? I think isolation. I think overscheduling and being too busy to see the world that is around us. I think taking time to go to the ocean that you have right here in this beautiful state of Rhode Island. I think it's part of our evolution that we have forgotten where we come from. And I think it's a practice. You know, I was reading Crab Cakes by James McPherson, and he says, practice is the thing. And I think one of the gifts of the pandemic, we all were desperate to get out. And the national parks were never more crowded. People were outside. Outdoor cafes are now here to stay. But I think, you know, to really make a practice of learning the names of other species and who we live among, of having eye contact every day with another species. And it is possible. You know, we live in the desert, and so it's possible. But I've been living in Cambridge, you know, for the last 5 years, for 6 months of the year. It's easy to forget the ground beneath your feet in a city like Cambridge or Boston, you know, because everyone's busy, they're in their mind, but then you want to go, but what about the wind? But what about that ant? Can I just tell a simple story? To me, this is what I had forgotten. I didn't even know. So there's a beautiful plant that we live with called a coyote willow, or a river willow. And they're very feathery leaves, and they have beautiful magenta blossoms on them, about the size of our little finger. And one day, this was in June 2020, it was covered. And I thought, I have to take a picture of this. It's so beautiful. Just then, this wind came up and blew every blossom off. And it was all over the porch. And I thought, this is so beautiful. I have to, you know, get a basket and save them. So I go inside to get a basket. I probably have attachment issues, you know. And when I came out, another wind just gone. They were all gone. And I was looking everywhere, and there was one blossom left. And I bent down to pick it up, and it moved. And I thought, blossoms don't move like that. And I got down on my hands and knees, and I saw it had 6 legs. And then I saw that it was an ant carrying this beautiful magenta coyote willow blossom in its mandibles. So I thought, what else am I going to do today? You know, I'll just follow this ant. So it was moving across the patio, turns, you know, left, is going down. I'm just watching. It's in a really quick little clip, moving along, like almost like a parasail on top. And then I see that it's going to go off the patio, and there's about a 2-inch drop, and I think, this is it. It's going to crash. It's over. That's over. Just as it's making that treacherous move, 4 ants emerge out of nowhere, lift up the magenta blossom, move it over all together, place it back down safely, disappear, and on goes the little ant on its way. And then I'm watching, and I realize, oh no, they're hitting the prickly pear patch. You know, they're going to be impaled. The blossom's never going to survive. This little ant is just going to be devastated. And I'm walking along. It goes into this treacherous territory. Around the, you know, spines, 3 ants emerge again, out of nowhere, lifted up, over, under, around, through, out. disappear, and on goes the little ant again with its magenta. It just keeps going, and then I see where we're headed. By now it's about 20 minutes, half hour, and I see this fist up from the desert, just, it's an anthill, and I think, okay, we're almost there. It pushes this, blossom up, up, up. It's so painful, it takes so long. It does it on its own, picks it up in its mandibles, makes it over onto the top, moves toward the opening, and lays it down. And in seconds, dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of ants eat it up into, just cut it up into little pieces. Each one takes it down, and I imagine that it's lining the pathway for the queen. I didn't know that there was a purpose for a blossom that remains in the mandible of an ant, and that there's a community along the way that will make sure that those petal parts are taken into the colony. How do we forget our connectedness? I think we forget to pay attention. And the world is so beautiful, interconnected, interrelated.
Kind of piggybacking on that. So with humanities and, I think the English creative writing realm, we're able to connect a little easier when it comes to nature. Do you have any recommendations for potentially like other subjects in study? I'm not saying STEM exactly, but other subjects that might not be able to integrate themselves into that nature aspect as much, if that makes sense.
What do you mean?
So there, like in my mind, I'm thinking of other, I teach high school, so I'm thinking like a high school realm, like as history, English, you can say, let's look outside, let's connect it to what we're teaching. Whereas other classes, I don't see that happening as much, which I think would help with what you were saying of not forgetting. Do you think that there's any way that that could happen where all forms of study could connect to nature?
I do. And I think it's a great idea. And thank you so much for bringing it to us. I'm a huge fan and proponent of interdisciplinary conversations. And I think, a lot of teachers, it's been my experience, feel that it takes more time to team teach with another discipline. I don't agree with that. I think that there's a depth. And another critique is that it's broad and shallow rather than narrow and deep. I don't believe with that either. I think it's about creativity. And some of the things I've seen that have been really successful in the environmental humanities program I was involved with at the University of Utah, and also what we're trying to do now at the Harvard Divinity School, is what would curriculum look like if climate was the connective tissue? How would one, what are the spiritual implications of climate? What would happen, how does one look at climate and an ethical response to life through the Center for the Environment that someone like Dan Schrag is thinking about? What would a piece of theater circling around climate look like? How would you introduce climate and statistics in a math class? What about art? What is the art of climate? I think climate is a beautiful example of how it could reach every aspect of our education. What are the geopolitics of climate? What is the philosophical aspect of climate? Can we love ourselves enough to change? Which is something the theologian Larry Rasmussen asks. That's a ponderous question. So I think that regarding nature, it's the same thing. Again, how do we act upon our curriculums with imagination? And if we were to have the natural world be part of that, you've already started this in such a beautiful way with the tour. It was all about the land. I'm envious of your beautiful commons, of your green, and the spaciousness, that there isn't traffic, that there's a peacefulness and a collectedness about this campus that I think it would be a beautiful place to begin. You could build a whole curriculum around the stream that is underground. So I think it's about creativity, imagination, and thought partners, where you say, we are going to bring the natural world into our curriculum in our classrooms. and then begin there. While we're waiting for the other question, when I was teaching 6th grade in Moab, the way in which we had an interdisciplinary curriculum based with nature was we had the principal allow us to give each child in the 6th grade, each student, a field guide to canyon country. And that field guide was used in every subject, and it was thrilling.
Hello. At one point, you talked about putting your hands into water and saying, I know of my vocabulary, and what came to me was not of my vocabulary. And it made me think about when we're outdoors, a lot of times now we're looking at nature mediated by a phone, or we're drowning out sound with earbuds. Did you have to cultivate a practice to be as present as you are to experiences like the ant and the petal, or has it always been your kind of default setting?
That's interesting, a default setting. I'm going to have to think about that. My grandmother gave me a bird book when I was 5. And when she gave it to me, she had a red pen in her hand, and she made 3 short lines, just like line, space, line, space, line, space, in the corner of the book. And she said to me, Terry, this is our secret. I love you. And so that book was always about love. And those birds, when we would go to Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge, were laced with my love of my grandmother. And I think she was my great teacher that would make us get up at 5 in the morning to see the birds when we were kicking and screaming, would make us sit on a log and just stare at what was at our feet. And gradually, we started seeing things. She was the one that taught me, you don't have to go chase the birds will come to you. And taught us how to psh, 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 or kiss the back of your hand. So I think Rachel Carson talks about every child needs the companionship of at least one adult to show them the wonders of the world. And I had a great teacher. And as a family, that was our spiritual ground. Whether it was my father taking us deer hunting, whether it was going to the national parks as a family, or watching them when my father would have to move to a town like Helper, Utah, put in gas lines. We played outside. So I think it was part of our upbringing, and I think it was an orientation of our particular family. I don't think that's unique. And I think children gravitate toward it. And I think that's why it's so important. And I started as a writer with children's books, because that's what I learned. And I do think it's a practice.
We'll take one last question.
Well, this is a bit of a sad one. I didn't know it would be last. How do you make peace with the injustice and the unfairness that grief carries, especially with losing loved ones?
How do you make peace with the injustices of grief and losing loved ones? I don't know. I think that's a practice too. Grief is the raven that sits on my shoulder every single day. Whether it's my brother whose death by suicide, still shatters me. Or my brother who died of lymphoma. We've had a lot of cancer in our family because of above ground nuclear testing in Utah. Again, it's a common experience where I come from. I spoke with a friend of mine yesterday, Melissa Bartholomew, who is Associate Dean at the Divinity School for Diversity identity and belonging. And she was talking about the high incidences of violent deaths and suicide among Black people. You know, grief is a sibling to love. And again, it's, for me, the question always is, how do we live in love with a broken heart? And that too is a practice. And again, for me personally, I would tell you, it's finding the strength to not look away again, but to face it. And we do it alone and we do it with others. And I think a grief endured, let me put it this way, a grief shared is a grief endured. I don't know how to answer the injustice. Death is something we live with, and I think that's one of the gifts of the natural world, is that things live, things die. There are tragic deaths and there are natural deaths. No death is easy. I'll end with this, and Jen and I were talking about it, and I had not planned on discussing this, but I can tell you how I lived with the death of my brother from suicide. And that was by following my youngest brother, who, when we asked to be able to see Dan's body before he was cremated, said to the gentleman in charge of the cremation, "We would like to participate." I would not have made that choice. I did not think that would be bearable. But I followed my youngest brother's lead, because what I didn't know is that he had made a vow to Dan that he would see that process through. And what we did was we washed his body, we placed sunflowers on his body, and we put feathers in his hand, and we carried his body into the retort as they closed that and watched the heat rise. We stayed for 6 hours, and Mr. Rabe, who was in charge of the cremation, in my mind was a Buddhist priest. He was dressed in a suit, he had welder's gloves, and at one point he said, "Would you like to see your brother's body?" And he opened the door of the retort, and there we saw, all I can tell you is it looked like prayer flags. It was so beautiful. And then he rearranged the bones and closed the container. And we waited another 2 hours. He opened it again. There was nothing there. I was stunned. And again, he rearranged almost like an Aikido dance, the bones, and then he swept the bones into 2 trays, and we followed him into another room, and he said, "Would you like to feel the last heat of your brother's life?" And I remember putting our hands over the bones and feeling that heat. And then he left Hank and I alone with Dan's bones. And I said to my brother, "Hank, what are you thinking?" And he said, "Probably the same thing you're thinking. Are they a rabbit's bones? Are they coyote's bones?" And our childhood came to the fore of all of the years we had spent gathering bones. It was what Dan loved most. And if you can imagine, there was humor and joy and love in that moment. And then Mr. Rabe came back and said, "Do you want to stay for the grinding of your brother's bones?" And we stayed. And we watched those bones turn into ash. And we watched those bones wade. And will you believe me if I tell you that those bones weighed, that ash weighed, 8 pounds, 4 ounces. The same weight of my brother's birth weight. The same weight of a gallon of water in the desert where he worked. When we left carrying Dan's ashes, we returned to my father and handed my father Dan's ashes. And he said, "What happened? You both look different." And we sat down and told Dad the story. I did not know we could have participated in that ritual. But the fact that we did was a healing. And so when I say, I think there is something in us that doesn't want to look away, there are times where we have to. But in that moment of my brother, Dan, I think it made his death bearable. I want to close and thank you for the bravery of your question, and I'm sorry for your losses. I want to close with this, something that we might take home as we think about how do we find the language that opens hearts rather than closes hearts. And it's from, this is for you, Jen, because you asked the question. It's from the open space of democracy. And I just want to say how much I appreciate this time with you, how much it means to me to stare into your eyes and to be able to be touched by your presence. And it's an honor to be here at the University of Rhode Island, and I will never forget you, and I look forward to coming back. And thank you, Jen, for your leadership. The human heart is the first home of democracy. It is where we embrace our questions. Can we be equitable? Can we be generous? Can we listen with our whole beings, not just our minds, and offer our attention rather than opinions? And do we have enough resolve in our hearts to act courageously, relentlessly, without giving up, ever, trusting our fellow citizens to join with us in our determined pursuit of a living democracy, especially the open space of democracy? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Williams, for an incredibly moving presentation, and Dean Reilly for facilitating such a stimulating conversation, and all of you for being here. I hope you'll linger for coffee, cookies, and book sales, and please also think about joining us next semester as our Environmental Humanities series continues on February 8th with a talk by Gavin Van Horn on Paths to Wilderness. Thanks, and have a wonderful evening.